No, we don't talk about sin that much in the church anymore, and yet there it is. It's all throughout the Old Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures. It's used throughout the New Testament. The Apostle Paul uses the word sin all throughout the book of Romans and elsewhere as he's trying to figure out a theology of salvation, of this Christ who laid his life down for us that we might be redeemed and reconciled before God. Jesus himself used the same word that Paul used when he taught his disciples how to pray. Do you remember in the book of Luke, his disciples came to him and said, Jesus, teach us how to pray. And he says, when you pray, pray like this, Abba, Father. And when he gets down to that little section on forgiveness, and we say this every week in our church, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us. Now, I know some of you are a Matthew church and you use the word debts. Forgive us our debts, because Matthew used the word debts. Luke's gospel uses the word sin. I don't know where y'all got trespasses. Actually, I do, but that's a whole different story. This is a Luke church. When we say the Lord's Prayer here, we say, forgive us our sins. The word that Paul and the word that Jesus used for sin is a Greek word, very familiar and actually older than the time of Jesus and Paul. The word is Hamartia. And for those of you who belong to the Brady Bunch generation, you can remember it this way. Hamartia, Hamartia, Hamartia. You see what I did just there? I got us to say Hamartia 4 times, 5 times, to help us remember the word in Greek for sin that Paul and Jesus uses. Hamartia, 6 times. Hamartia really means to miss the mark. To miss the mark, to miss the place we're aiming for, to miss the destination we're journeying toward. If I was working with a bow and an arrow and I kept shooting my arrows and they kept landing next to the target rather than hitting the target, that's Hamartia. Or if the arrow falls short of the target, that's Hamartia. You know, every night before I get in bed, I take off my t-shirt and I throw it to the dirty clothes basket, and you know what? Only 1 out of 5 times do I hit that dirty clothes basket. I'm committing hamartia with my shirt. I'm missing the mark almost every night. But you know, we do that spiritually with God, don't we? We miss the mark with God. The Hebrew Scriptures say we should love God, seek justice, we should love kindness and walk humbly with God all the days of our life. What does the Lord require? Seek justice, love kindness, walk humbly all the days of your life. We even have a number of songs we sing about it. But do we get all 3 all the time? I mean, some days we love kindness, and some days we walk humbly with God. But what about justice? You know, some days we're loving and we're very kind and compassionate, but we're not going to get out there and march and seek justice, at least not that way. And other days, though we are seeking justice and we're working for reconciliation in our world, but we forget to be kind, or we forget to walk humbly with God. We're so bound and determined to make our agenda the right agenda, the only agenda. We forget to treat our neighbor with kindness, or we forget to walk humbly with God. Sometimes we miss the mark, so to speak. Jesus said the greatest commandment was to love God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. And I think there are days we do all 4 of those, but not days that we do all 4 in a single day. I think some days we love God very tenderly and warmly with our hearts. And with our soul we feel a deep-rooted love for God. But some days we forget to love God with our minds. We turn our brain off at the door sometimes. Some days we love God so intellectually we forget to have that experiential relationship with God. I know people who can tell me all sorts of facts and figures about God, but they haven't really entered into a deep relationship with God. And loving God with our strength, sometimes we do, but sometimes we don't. The preacher asks us to show up for a volunteer day. Or how about this? The preacher asks us if we might volunteer to teach a children's Sunday school class for 6 or 8 weeks. And we go, well, I'm really busy right now, preacher, and I got a lot on my table. And, well, we're loving God some ways, but not all the ways, all the time. Sometimes we miss the mark. Jesus said the second commandment is the same as the first. Love your neighbor as yourself, or love your neighbor as one of your own. And some days we get picky and choosy about who our neighbor actually is. Well, I'll love that neighbor, and I'll help that neighbor out, but that can't be my neighbor. That person looks different than me. They sound different than me. They come from a different place than I come from. They don't live in the same part of... My neighbor only is next door. But Jesus didn't define that. He said your neighbor is the one in need. Now, sometimes we miss the mark. Sometimes we commit hamartia. So we're